It was here at La Unión, 200 miles west of Buenos Aires, that Juan Duarte spent 6 months of every year away from home. During these long months, Duarte grew close to one of his employees, Juana Ibarguren. Although never legally married, Juana bore Duarte 5 children. The youngest was born on May 7, 1919, with the help of midwife Juana Gaiquil, a Native American from the Mapuche Nation, former owners of these lands before the arrival of the white settlers from Buenos Aires. The newborn would live a brief but stormy life. She would rise from poverty to power and lead Argentina into the second half of the 20th century. She would divide public opinion and accomplish what no other woman in Argentina had ever done. They named her Maria Eva, but the world would come to know her as Evita. The Great War proved to be good for Argentine exports. In Europe, grain and meat were in high demand. Duarte, like most of his rural neighbors, profited from the conflict. After Germany's capitulation, the tides turned. International prices dropped, and the Argentine economy lost momentum. Good times were coming to an end, and, to make things worse, Hipólito Yrigoyen, representing the interests of the sons and daughters of immigrant workers, had been elected president of Argentina. Evita was just a year old when her father was forced to leave La Unión and relocate with Juana and their 5 children. Duarte was offered a job in neighboring Quiroga, a dot on the map in the middle of the Pampas. The experience was short-lived, and 12 months later, Duarte declared bankruptcy. His assets were sold at public auction, and the adventure was over. Juana and the children moved to a small 2-room brick house in Los Toldos, and Duarte returned to Chivilcoy, where his legitimate wife, Adela, and their 3 children waited for his return. Los Toldos, Juana Ibarguren's hometown, was a quiet, rural town of 3,000, with a local theater and a rail station that linked the village to the rest of the country. In Spanish, Los Toldos means the tents. It was the name given to the settlement near the reservation of Chief Coliqueo. The house in Los Toldos is today a museum to the memory of Evita. In the 1920s, it was located near the rail station, not far from the main square. Bedroom and living quarters were one and the same. A separate room served as the kitchen. It remains a mystery whether Juan Duarte ever came to visit, although it seems reasonable that he helped financially. Despite hardships, things were going well in Los Toldos for the small tribe, as Juana often referred to herself and her 5 children. Working as a freelance seamstress helped Juana pay the rent and send the children to school. Religion played an important role in the family's life. A picture of Evita, taken the day of her first communion at the local church, is probably the only proof left of her early devotion. Although it was common knowledge among the neighbors that the littlest one was obsessed with the supernatural, God, and particularly with the Virgin Mary. On January 8, 1926, Juana learned that her former boss and the father of her children had died in a car accident only the day before. Again, life was changing, and the future was now more uncertain than ever. The following morning, the small tribe boarded the train to Chivilcoy. The families knew of each other's existence, and yet the rules were strict. The illegitimate were not to cross the line, and that is exactly what Juana was about to do. Rumor has it that when the unwelcome reached Duarte's gates, they were insulted and humiliated. Finally, after negotiating terms, they were allowed in, while the rest of the mourners waited, indignant, in a separate room. Evita, then just 7 years old, took a last and unique glance at her father, a man she hardly knew. Word of the tragedy in Chivilcoy spread quickly, and life in Los Toldos became unbearable. Becoming socially accepted was a full-time job, and Juana was not succeeding. Evita had fallen behind at school, and her sisters, along with her brother Juan, became the family breadwinners. The world around the small tribe was falling apart, just as the big picture was showing signs of distress. Argentina and the world were now heading towards a major recession. In October of 1929, the U.S. stock market crash triggered a worldwide economic collapse. The news spread across Europe and South America with devastating effect. The shock waves of the Great Depression battered the stock exchange in Buenos Aires, and it was worse in the rural areas. Argentina was badly hurt as crop prices plunged by 50%. High unemployment forced many nations in Europe and South America to set up public relief programs, and the political scenario quickly polarized. Capitalism and democracy were widely perceived as the source of all evils. Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini were proposing a new agenda, a new world order. Once again, the world stood at the brink of war. Argentina was closely following developments across the Atlantic. The working class felt close to the struggle of the Soviet Union, while the middle and upper classes were divided over their sympathies for the Allies and the axis of Nazi fascism. The Argentine armed forces, clearly influenced by their German and Italian counterparts, found inspiration in the standoff of the latter against the perceived threat of liberals, Jews, and capitalism at large. In September of 1930, a pro-fascist coup led by General Uriburu inaugurated an era of military intolerance, pseudo-democratic governments, and puppet regimes that would last almost half a century. Argentina was now marching to the drums of fascist Rome and Nazi Berlin. By September 1930, Juana and her children had moved from Los Toldos. Following the railroad on a straight path to the north, the small tribe relocated to the city of Junín, where Juana opened a boarding house popular among salesmen, army officers, and federal bureaucrats away from home.
Evita's family came from Los Toldos and settled here in Junín. The family group consisted of Juana Ibarguren de Duarte, Evita's brother Juan, Evita and her sisters Elisa, Blanca, and Herminda, also known as Gija.
The following year, Evita was enrolled in the 3rd grade at the local school, a magnificent neoclassic building on the main square, facing the church and the city hall. Miss Palmira Repetti, Evita's 6th grade teacher, recalled many years later that unique, intelligent, and beautiful young girl.
She was tall, slim, and brunette, a little lady, vivacious and intelligent. She lived nearby on the south edge of town. In her own way, Evita was unique and free-spirited. She would often sneak out of class, and if I wanted to know where she had gone, the answer often was, "She has left, Miss Palmira. She has left."
Junín was a significant cultural center in the middle of the Pampas. Major figures of the Buenos Aires Music Hall routinely passed through Junín on tour, performing live in front of the microphones of the local Radio Prieto. Evita spent endless hours listening to Argentina's favorite musicals and melodramas, daydreaming to the sound of foxtrots and the tango of the 1930s. On weekends, dance floors were packed, and Carnival at the Crystal Palace was a main attraction. Eventually, the ghosts from Los Toldos caught up with the family. Some of Evita's classmates would admit years later to what everyone else knew. Illegitimate children were cursed and sinful, a bad example in good Catholic society. Despite the glamour and the extravagance of the 30s, the secrets of the past were back to haunt Juana and the children.
The kids at school didn't care for Evita. Given the circumstances, it made sense. Back then in the provinces, to be conceived out of wedlock meant to be cursed. Evita had reasons to feel hurt and resentful. Although Evita never said a word to me, I know she suffered as a consequence of the relationship between her mother and Juan Duarte.
By the age of 15, Evita had dropped out of school and was obsessed with the idea of someday becoming a star. She would sit in the dark at the local cinema, memorizing the lines of her favorite stars.
We were good confidants. One time she mentioned that she wanted to go to Buenos Aires to become a radio or even a movie star.
Oh yes, she wanted to be an artiste. She joined all the school plays, and the other teachers would call me when they needed talent for their plays. "Palmira, why don't you send us La Duarte?" They called her La Duarte.
The magazines and the silver screen offered choices not commonly available in Junín. It was unfair competition. Opportunities at hand were limited to a small part in a local play, making announcements on Radio Prieto, or a quiet life next to husband and children. That was not what Evita had in mind. If she was ever going to make it, she had to escape before it was too late. Goodbye, Junín. Hello, Buenos Aires. Evita arrived in the capital of Argentina in the summer of 1935. The financial crisis of the early 30s was almost over, and Buenos Aires, an international metropolis of 2 million, was undergoing a major facelift. City blocks were being demolished to open the way for major avenues, and traffic was becoming a permanent fixture. The Graf Zeppelin paid a visit just a year earlier, and tango had become a major hit on Broadway and the Champs-Élysées, placing Argentina firmly on the entertainment map of the world. A 220-foot obelisk was erected to celebrate the coming of a new era. The scenario was ideal for a newcomer fresh off the Pampas, looking to make it in the big city. Evita was only 16, she was beautiful, and she was determined to make a name for herself. In March of 1935, Eva Duarte got her first break, a small role in a vaudeville show. The following year, she played another supporting role in the local version of Lillian Hellman's play, Little Foxes. Evita was finally working in the theater, but the pay did not cover the high cost of living in Buenos Aires. Like so many other girls trying to make it in show business, she often resorted to dating those who could afford a good meal. Evita carefully chose her occasional dates. In a short time, she managed to meet some influential men who recognized her potential and were willing to help. Samuel Yankelevich, owner of a major broadcast station, was among the first and most powerful. Yankelevich gave Evita her first opportunity in front of a live audience. It was a major break. Emilio Kartulowicz, publisher of Sintonia magazine, boosted her image with the publication of a few articles, and Evita's picture appeared on the cover of the magazine she regarded as the Bible for success. Each new acquaintance became a step in the right direction. Soon, she was answering calls for modeling jobs, publicity, and advertising. The photos taken during this period prove that the 16-year-old was now turning into a beautiful young woman. In 1937, Evita appeared briefly in the motion picture Seconds Out, a film directed by Chaz de Cruz, a local celebrity. Then, more theater and radio, and more secondary roles in B movies. 5 years after landing in Buenos Aires, Evita was steadily climbing a ladder that would lead to the greatest accumulation of influence and power ever accomplished by any woman in the history of Argentina.
Good evening, everybody.
On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, triggering the onset of World War II. Argentina, populated mainly by European immigrants, followed the developments in every newspaper headline and radio broadcast. News from the front line came with frightening reports from the BBC, Radio Moscow, and the Voice of America. Radios had become a must in every household, and the conflict, so deeply affecting the local population, wasn't the only thing striking the heart of the Argentine family.
Operations in the direction of England.
¿Cómo explicaros la tristeza de mis días?
Radio melodramas were increasingly popular, and Evita's voice was starting to fill the airwaves. Her semi-celebrity status brought her close to the Minister of Radio and Communications, Colonel Aníbal Imbert, and the two of them began a somewhat serious romance. With Colonel Imbert by her side, Evita won a salary increase and a string of new contacts with high-ranking officers in a country where uniforms were not only fashionable, but extremely helpful. On June 4th, 1943, a military putsch led by General Arturo Rawson ousted President Ramon Castillo. General Rawson resigned after 2 days when his anti-conservative views and his support of the United Nations won no military backing. Argentina was now heading towards fascism with the cadence of a military goose step. General Pedro Ramirez replaced Rawson as president. Ramirez maintained neutrality in the war, but faced increasing opposition from all political groups except the nationalist right wing. He outlawed political parties, silenced the press, and vertically organized labor unions in a Mussolini-styled labor front, arresting without warrant and imprisoning without trial. Among the top-ranking officers of the new regime was a handsome, tall, and charismatic officer who would climb swiftly through the ranks to become, in less than 3 years, the most popular political figure of Argentina. His name, Juan Domingo Perón, Colonel Perón.
Renació la esperanza en los hogares, brilla el sol con más fuerza y esplendor, ondea majestuosa en tierra y mares, la bella y arrogante bicolor.
Enlutó al país la noticia de los terribles y luctuosos acontecimientos que se produjeron como consecuencia del terremoto ocurrido en la ciudad de San Juan el pasado 15 de enero.
In January of 1944, an earthquake devastated the western city of San Juan. The military was quick to turn the tragedy into an opportunity for government propaganda, and Colonel Perón was appointed head of relief operations. Perón organized a festival to benefit the victims, held at Luna Park Arena in downtown Buenos Aires.
Mujeres y niños que por igual han sentido en carne propia la enorme desgracia de nuestros hermanos de San Juan.
El Luna Park estaba repleto, ya no cabía un alfiler.
The arena was packed. It was a full house. We were there with the rest of the crews getting interviews. Suddenly, I ran into Rita Molina and Eva Duarte. They asked if I could help them bypass security. It was almost impossible. Then I saw my cousin, Homero Mansi, and asked him if there was anything he could do. Eva Duarte and Rita Molina were almost immediately in. Once inside and seeing how crowded it was, Eva asked Homero where could they sit. He pointed out 2 seats next to Imbert and Perón. I have no idea how they got through the crowd, but they did. It was that night that Eva Duarte met Perón.
Perón was a new challenge. It would turn out to be a match made in heaven, Cinderella and Prince Charming. Colonel Perón was much more than Evita had hoped for. He was handsome, twice her age, in charge of the rising regime, and a father figure, not only to Evita, but to the entire nation as well. Evita wasted no time. That same night, after the festival, the young actress and the handsome colonel drove 20 miles to the river resort of Tigre in the muddy Delta waterways. The following morning, Evita arrived for work in a limousine reserved for the War Ministry. On January 26, 1944, President Ramirez broke off diplomatic relations with Germany and Japan. The move was a direct response to diplomatic pressure from the Allies and seriously affected Ramirez's credibility among the high-ranking officers still clearly in favor of the fascist regimes. Ramirez was soon removed by a coup, and the presidency was turned over to General Edelmiro Farrell, a candidate less inclined to confront Berlin. Next to Farrell, Perón would accumulate unprecedented power. In a short period, he was appointed Secretary of War, Secretary of Work and Social Welfare, and Vice President. Perón would ultimately hold all 3 titles simultaneously. Perón and Eva Duarte soon became an item. The affair made it impossible to ignore her at castings and auditions. After all, she was now the girlfriend of the most powerful man in Argentina. Evita was soon hired for a co-leading role in a new motion picture starring the well-known Libertad Lamarque. Margarita Brondolo, then assistant editor at the Studios San Miguel, recalls Evita's first day on the set.
It happened very early one day. Eva Duarte came in for makeup and hair before Libertad Lamarque. Noticing she was there first, Evita occupied the dressing room reserved for Lamarque, who was indeed the film's leading lady and a major star. The next thing I know, Lamarque shows up and all hell broke loose. I can't even begin to tell you. Some say they pulled each other by their hair, but I can assure you they had screamed very loud at each other.
On March 27, 1945, Argentina finally declared war on Germany and Japan. 6 weeks later, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. The defeat of the Third Reich forced Farrell and Perón to implement concessions. Most ultranationalist elements were replaced immediately to appease growing criticism coming from the United States and Great Britain. With Perón's support, Evita managed to recommend a handful of loyal friends to high-ranking government positions. Oscar Nicolini, Juana Ibarguren's boyfriend, became director of the National Post Office, controlling all major communications. Nicolini would eventually play a key role in the nationalization of radio stations, providing Perón and Evita with the tools to seduce a nation. Oscar Lomuto, another friend, was appointed Undersecretary of Information. Playwright José Muñoz Aspiri was designated head of propaganda, and Juan Duarte, Evita's brother, became Perón's private secretary and the man in charge of all the colonel's transactions, both public and private. Evita was beginning to make her influence felt in the creation of an articulate and extremely powerful state. 5 years earlier, Evita had written to her mother in Junín that she was not going to come back until she had conquered the big city. Now she had, and there was no going back. Juan was already in Buenos Aires, and the rest of her siblings soon joined her. The saga that began at the Hacienda La Unión 26 years earlier had reached the end of the tracks. The small tribe was reunited at last. By 1945, universities across the country were brought under direct control of the federal government. Right-wing elements close to the Catholic Church were appointed by Perón to most faculties. Students and professors were beaten and incarcerated. Campuses became a focus for resistance. The Socialist Party rallied in celebration of the liberation of Paris, calling for freedom and liberty and an end to the dictatorship. The war in Europe was over, but the developments in Argentina were perceived as a continuation of the conflict overseas. Misled into believing that Perón was going out of style like most European fascists, a group of liberal officers hatched a plot to oust Perón. There was little support President Farrell could lend Perón to avoid the outcome if he was to remain in charge. On October 9, 1945, Perón was forced to resign. 2 days later, the colonel and Evita once again took refuge in Tigre, where they had spent their first night together. The escape was short-lived, and the following morning, Perón was apprehended and spent the next days under house arrest in Martín García, a mosquito-infested island off the coast of Buenos Aires. Immediately after Perón's arrest, Evita was fired from her job at the studio. Her quest for glory was virtually over. Her final film, The Prodigy, was not even released. It was time for Eva Duarte to write, direct, and star in her own film, in the story of a lifetime, as Evita. Perón wrote a handful of letters from house arrest in Martín Garcia. At least 2 of the letters show Perón's devotion. Today, he wrote, I have written to Farrell asking to accelerate my retirement. As soon as I get out, we'll get married and go someplace to live in peace. This idea scared the living daylights out of the young actress, who hadn't come this far only to settle for a good marriage and a quiet life in the countryside. If Evita was going to get her show on the road, Perón had to be free. Under the false pretext that he needed medical attention, President Farrell arranged for the release of his friend, who was quickly taken to Veterans Hospital in Buenos Aires. On October 17, 1945, thousands marched demanding the immediate release of Perón. The armed forces, fearing a bloodbath, stood still. The police, unable to restrain the crowd, watched as they poured into the city. The ruling elite felt as if the Bastille was about to be torched and the Winter Palace stormed by a mob determined to change the course of history. Argentina, as it was known, would never be the same. After much deliberation, Farrell called upon Perón. If anyone was going to tell the crowd outside the presidential palace to disperse and go home, it was him. Perón agreed. In exchange, Farrell would call for presidential elections within 4 months. The arrangement satisfied the liberal wing of the armed forces, which had greatly underestimated Perón's ability to survive. The colonel was no longer contemplating retirement. The road to the presidency was now clear. However, Evita had no plans to be the mistress of the next president.
Ya yo estoy decidido a casarme contigo, porque sé que me quieres.
Before the wedding, Evita managed to have her birth certificate destroyed, along with any evidence that would have prevented an army officer from marrying an illegitimate child. The new documents would show Evita to be 3 years younger. This was not a matter of vanity. Rather, it legitimized Evita's birth, since by 1922, her father, Juan Duarte, had become a widower, rendering his relationship with Juana Ibarguren legitimate. This was the first, but not the last time, that Evita would use her power to change the official story. She and Perón were married in Junín on October 22, 1945, and a few weeks later exchanged vows in a semi-secret religious ceremony at St. Francis Church in the city of La Plata. On March 24, 1946, Farrell's promise of a presidential election materialized. Perón and his newly created Labor Party campaigned on a platform of fervent patriotism. Capitalism and communism were portrayed as 2 sides of the same coin, and Perón was offering himself as an alternative to both. Sproul Braden, the American ambassador, openly spoke against Perón, ultimately adding to the argument that imperialist forces were behind the opposition. President Perón became the Labor Party's campaign slogan. Argentina finally went to the polls, and Perón prevailed. He was now the new president, and Evita, the most powerful woman in Argentina. The day Perón took office, the vaults at the central bank were loaded after years of gold bullion, contraband, and Nazi refugee deposits. The caste and budget were now in place. Evita, standing next to Perón, addressed the crowd from the balcony of Casa Rosada, the presidential palace. That day marked Evita's debut, scene one, take one, of the most fascinating and yet frightening show ever made in Argentina. As First Lady, Evita spent hours debating and listening to union delegates from all over the country. She was witty and streetwise, and felt she knew the hearts and minds of the workers. Evita's lack of formal education played in her favor, helping to build and consolidate a close relationship with the union bosses, who associated levels of literacy with the wrongdoings of the ruling class. Everything Evita said and did was recorded on film, and the newsreels were delivered to theaters all over the country. She not only was a star in the leading role of a lifetime, she was also getting more publicity than Ava Gardner or Ginger Rogers, all courtesy of the state propaganda machine.
La suya fue una actividad infatigable. Siempre fue la primera en llegar donde un dolor la reclamaba. Todas las expresiones del trabajo y la cultura tuvieron en ella a su mejor abanderada.
Two years had passed since the end of World War II, and Argentina needed to make amends within the European community. Something had to be done, and Evita seemed the perfect ambassador. The role called for a new look. Beautiful and blonde were fashionable. Jewelry, furs, designer clothes, and expensive cars would make up for all Evita had missed before, and the people loved it. An illegitimate child of a failed relationship between a middle-class businessman and his servant had made it to the top, and she looked like $1 million. In June of 1947, Eva Duarte embarked on what she called the Rainbow Tour. The first stop was Madrid, capital of Franco's post-war Spain. Franco welcomed the First Lady with honors. Thousands of cheering Spaniards poured onto the streets of Madrid.
Los obreros de España despiden a la señora María Eva Duarte de Perón horas antes de su partida hacia Roma.
Italy was next. For the first time, a woman was greeted at Roman City Hall with all the honors of a foreign dignitary. The Italian press labeled Evita La Signora Presidentessa. While at the Vatican, the Holy Father requested the First Lady to provide sanctuary for a handful of Croatian war criminals who later joined former Nazis already in Argentina, training federal and state secret police. Lisbon was next. Dictator Salazar welcomed Evita in Portugal, where the First Lady met Umberto I of Savoia, former king of Italy and fervent sponsor of Mussolini. Paris was next, and then a short visit to Zurich, where bankers hoped to capitalize on the growing personal fortune of the presidential couple. Since 1945, the State and Treasury Departments of the United States had conclusive evidence of illegal dealings and transfers of gold and currency between Argentina and Swiss banks. The rainbow tour was almost over. Evita had spent over 2 months building bridges with Europe.
Ella fue, para los pueblos de la vieja Europa, la visión joven y hermosa de un pueblo feliz, como la imagen siempre añorada de la mejor sonrisa de la vida.
From her European experience, Evita learned that simplicity was most effective outside the ballrooms and royal courtyards. Upon her return in August 1947, she changed her charisma entirely. In public appearances, a simple tailored suit replaced fancy couture. The hairstyle changed accordingly. Her neat chignon became a signature look.
Hoy la mujer argentina, la que nunca se doblega y la que siempre se juega por Evita y por Perón.
By now, the Labor Party had been reorganized as the Peronist Party. It was a clever move. To advocate the interests of the labor movement meant to be a Peronist. Anti-Peronists, by definition, were enemies of the working class. Evita's next step was to organize women within the party. In her own words, to be a Peronist woman meant to be loyal and to have blind confidence in Perón. The Women's Civil Rights Act was passed, and Evita addressed a massive demonstration in Plaza de Mayo. She was already an accomplished public speaker. Evita was determined to fight for what she believed was an ongoing Peronist revolution, one without precedent. Lack of an official appointment within the government did not undermine her will to launch a major campaign in support of Perón. Traditionally, the First Lady was designated the Honorable Chairperson of the Society of Charitable Women of Argentina. A tradition was about to be broken. The society was to deny the privilege under the pretense that Evita was still too young and immature. Evita dissolved the society and established her own, the Maria Eva Duarte de Perón Foundation. The new society was to be presided over by Evita for as long as she lived, and bankrolled with federal resources, contributions, wage withholdings, and extorted donations. Evita was taking her role as godmother to all too seriously. She inaugurated hospitals, schools, safe havens for single mothers, and homes for the elderly.
Los niños pobres eran en aquel momento los desheredados de la suerte y la fortuna. No sabían de sonrisa, de ternura, ni del placer de un juguete.
A miniature city was built not far from Buenos Aires. It was meant for children to play and learn. It was fun and clever, an incubator for future Peronists. Evita was convinced that it was the women who would bring Perón his second term as president of Argentina. Moreover, it was the children who would reaffirm his mandate in a not-so-distant future. Support for the regime was encouraged in public schools, where religion had become mandatory. School textbooks emphasized Evita's maternal role as a tender and generous soul. My mommy loves me. Evita loves me too. Learning how to read and write also meant understanding the rules of the game, a game in which everyone was being reminded at all times of Evita's generosity and love for mankind. At Christmas, Santa Evita would personally bring toys printed with the regime's propaganda. while her voice captured the hearts of millions with a soft and tender tone.
Sean eternas para la Argentina esta sonrisa de paz de Nochebuena. Que donde quiera que nos encamine el destino como país, sea nuestra meta y sea nuestra primera preocupación, imitando humildemente a Cristo, el corazón del hombre y el amor por el prójimo. Así sean encaminados en patria.
It was a new religion called Peronism, and Evita was to be regarded as the apostle of the dispossessed. However, all too soon, the resources began to dry out. The vaults at the central bank, once loaded with gold, were now virtually empty. Argentina was now more Peronist than ever. Joining the party was required to apply for government jobs and teaching positions. Radios and newspapers were nationalized. No news was to be printed without the approval of the feared Raúl Appold, a close advisor to Evita and Minister of Information. From now on, total control. Nazi-styled paraphernalia and propaganda were a constant reminder that fascism was alive and well in Argentina. Oligarchy became Evita's favorite word to identify anything and anyone opposing her will and that of the Peronist revolution. The territory of La Pampa, birthplace of Evita and Perón, was renamed after the First Lady, and the former territory of Chaco became Presidente Perón Province. Streets and cities were also renamed after the presidential couple. Boats, planes, railroad stations, schools, hospitals, stadiums, and airports were named after Evita or Perón. Europe was now slowly recovering from years at war. The Marshall Plan, implemented by the United States, had grave consequences for Argentina. The European export market for grain and meat was lost to the United States. Without a backup plan, Argentina was beginning to feel the effects of a new recession. Once again, the United States became the scapegoat. The Americans were stifling Argentine business abroad, and the dream of a Peronist paradise was grinding to a halt.
Escuchen bien, compañeros. El que le hace una huelga al peronismo es un carnero de la oligarquía. Hacerle una huelga a Perón es trabajar para la antipatria.
The workers had been warned. No strikes against Perón. Evita founded the women's wing of the Peronist Party and helped organize it by setting up recruitment centers in small towns, as the General Confederation of Labor called for the First Lady to become the next vice president. In August of 1951, 2 million rallied in Buenos Aires to support the presidential ticket of Perón Perón. A massive march was scheduled, and workers were bussed in from all corners of the country to encourage the First Lady's commitment. It was a dream come true. Cameras, lights, and a cheering audience below. Although Evita enjoyed extraordinary support, she was beginning to suspect that the armed forces and the oligarchy were behind a plot to keep her from achieving her goal. However, the truth behind Perón's reluctance to back her nomination was indeed more dramatic. Unbeknown to Eva Duarte, she had been diagnosed with cervical cancer. It all happened too fast. What the crowds gathered to support Evita heard was her heartfelt renunciation. The First Lady was dying.
¿Ustedes creen que si el puesto de vicepresidenta fuera una carga y que fuera una solución, no hubiera ya contestado que sí?
The veil of secrecy surrounding Evita's health was absolute. The First Lady was told she had appendicitis, and she believed a simple intervention would be carried out by her physician. In the meantime, Perón made arrangements for New York cancer surgeon George T. Pack to be flown into Buenos Aires to head the team of experts that would perform a hysterectomy on the First Lady. Dr. Pack entered the operating room only after Evita was fully sedated, and he left before she ever regained consciousness. A group of army officers felt they could not wait for the regime to collapse and tried to overthrow Perón. Evita was beginning to confront the facts. She was dying, and the regime she helped build and sustain was at the brink of collapse. Evita felt she was being attacked from within and without. Cancer and the feared oligarchy were about to pull down the curtains on the role of a lifetime. In a desperate act, Evita ordered the purchase of 5,000 pistols and 1,500 machine guns to be distributed among union workers in case of yet another military uprising. On Election Day, November 11, 1951, Evita cast her own vote from her hospital bed. Outside, thousands of women exercised their civil rights for the first time, and Perón was re-elected for a second consecutive term as President of Argentina. On May 1st, 1952, Evita addressed the crowds gathered at Plaza de Mayo for the last time. She was a fragile figure of just over 80 pounds and had to be held by Perón as she was constantly about to faint.
Yo no quise ni quiero nada para mí. Mi gloria es y será siempre el escudo de Perón y la bandera de mi pueblo. Y aunque dejen el camino jirones de mi vida, yo sé que ustedes recogerán mi nombre y lo llevarán como bandera a la victoria.
On June 6th, Evita, heavily sedated, was fitted with a straight metal cast and joined her husband as they paraded through the streets of Buenos Aires on the way to Perón's second inauguration. On July 26th, a crowd gathered in front of the presidential residence to pray for the one they regarded as the spiritual leader of the nation. At sundown, thousands of torches lit up the winter skies of Buenos Aires. Argentina was wrapped in silence as a somber broadcast issued from the Ministry of Information.
Cumple la Subsecretaría de Informaciones de la Presidencia de la Nación el penosísimo deber de informar al pueblo de la República que a las 20:25 horas ha fallecido la señora Eva Perón, jefa espiritual de la Nación. Los restos de la señora Eva Perón serán conducidos mañana, en horas de la mañana, al Ministerio de Trabajo y Previsión.
Evita was dead. At Perón's request, her body was embalmed to be preserved for eternity. On August 9th, Evita was taken to the parliament, and thousands passed by her coffin to pay their last respects. Evita was then taken to the Workers' Confederation headquarters. Over 2 million followed the cortege, which had been choreographed like that of a Roman emperor. Paramount Pictures staged what would be remembered as the first color mega-production in Argentina. And in a final grand cinematic turn, Evita's performance was coming to the end. Later, on June 16, 1955, the armed forces, in an attempt to kill Perón, bombarded downtown Buenos Aires without warning. Hundreds of civilians were killed. The attempt failed, and Perón was able to hold on to power until September, when yet another revolution forced him into exile. Once again, thousands of cheering Argentines jammed the streets to celebrate. The king is dead. Long live the king. Without Perón by her side, Evita once again became a target for her enemies. On November 22nd, General Aramburu, leading officer of the latest revolution, ordered his military commandos to seize Evita's corpse. The operation was to be the beginning of a long and macabre journey. At some point, the corpse was hidden in the attic of Major Arandia, Aramburu's second in command. One night, hearing sounds coming from his attic, Arandia reached for his weapon and shot in the dark, killing his pregnant wife. Evita was becoming an embarrassment to the new government. With the complicity of the Vatican, Aramburu planned to ship the remains out of the country. 25 identical coffins were manufactured and delivered to 25 collaborators, with strict orders to get rid of Evita in absolute secrecy. As time passed, many broke the pact of silence through family or friends. Some confessed to have buried Evita in Uruguay or Chile, where Juana Ibarguren, Evita's mother, was now living in exile. Others were prepared to testify that Evita had been laid to rest on the island of Martin Garcia, where Perón had been taken under arrest in October of 1945. There were those who swore to have incinerated the corpse, and still, there were also those who recall shipping the former First Lady for burial in Belgium, Germany, or Italy. It was not until many years later that the truth would surface. The remains of Maria Eva Duarte de Perón arrived in Genoa, Italy, on April 23, 1957. A few days later, she was laid to rest in Milan under the fictitious name of Maria Maggi de Magistris. "13 years later, the terrorist organization known as Montoneros kidnapped former President Aramburu, demanding the immediate restitution of the corpse. The military tried to reconstruct the evidence at hand, but not even Aramburu knew where the real Eva Duarte had been buried. The government failed to find the general or his abductors, and Aramburu was executed June 1st, 1970. In September of 1971, then President General Lanusse orchestrated Operation Return, and the remains of Eva Duarte were finally exhumed and brought to Perón's doorstep in Madrid, where the general, now married to Maria Estela Martinez, had been living under the protection of General Francisco Franco. Perón returned to Argentina in 1973 to be re-elected for a third term. Maria Estela, a former chorus girl known as Isabelita, joined the nomination, becoming vice president, a dream denied her predecessor 20 years earlier. In the meantime, Evita's coffin remained in Perón's residence in the suburbs of Madrid, guarded by Franco's secret police. When Perón died of natural causes shortly after his third inauguration, Isabelita was sworn in as the first woman to head the Argentine state. During this short-lived and chaotic administration, Montoneros ransacked Aramburu's crypt at the Recoleta cemetery, kidnapping the general a second time. Once again, they demanded that Evita be returned. This time, they succeeded. Evita was laid to rest next to Perón in a crypt built at the presidential residence where Isabelita was living at the time. Isabelita was finally overthrown by a military coup on March 24, 1976. The new military regime relocated once again the bodies of the former rulers of Argentina. Evita was placed in the Duarte Mausoleum at the Recoleta Cemetery. In the years to come, Perón's grave would be desecrated at least twice, and his hands cut off and stolen. In 2006, ghosts of Argentina's turbulent political past rose again as the remains of Perón were transferred from Buenos Aires to a new mausoleum at San Vicente, the presidential retreat favored by Perón and Evita at the peak of their powerful affair. The melee left at least 40 people injured, though it appeared that no one was hurt when one of the combatants emptied his gun at the entrance of the residence, which is now a museum dedicated to the former president. It is believed that someday Evita will join her husband in San Vicente, where there are plans to erect a memorial to perpetuate the legacy of the most revered and yet despised couple in the history of Argentina. For the time being, Evita rests in Recoleta, next to Aramburu and the mausoleums of the most prominent families of Argentina. Every day, thousands of tourists from all over the globe come to visit, certain that this is the final resting place of the woman who inspired so much from so many. Nevertheless, there are reasons to believe the saga will continue to unfold.